After having listened to the Horst Wessel song, I think that this can be an example for us of several things that were happening in Weimar Germany. Uh, on the one hand, we see the absolute violence that had gripped politics by 1930. And we see the shift that the National Socialist German Workers' Party has made towards being, at least in its public representations, almost exclusively anti-communist. And so remembering that the Nazi Party is going to present itself as the bulwark and as the defense against Bolshevism is something that you can see even in just the lyrics of the Horst Wessel song. This increase in violence leads to an increase in the paramilitaries, in non-army militias that are controlled by various political parties. So the National Socialists have their group of Stormtroopers. This shouldn't be confused with what will later be the most important paramilitary of the Nazi Party, which is the SS. The SS was originally formed just as a private bodyguard for Adolf Hitler, but at this time, by far their largest paramilitary organization are the SA, or the Stormtroopers. The KPD, the communists, also have a paramilitary, the Red Front Fighters League. And throughout 1930, these paramilitary organizations are sparring in the streets. Obviously, having these paramilitaries are a challenge both to the police and actually to the Weimar Republic's military, which, as you'll remember, was limited to just 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles. So having tens of thousands of men in political paramilitary groups really is a threat not just to the police force, but also to the Republic. Both the army and the police, their loyalty to the Weimar Republic is limited. We have numerous examples in both cases where they don't feel particularly supported by the Weimar coalition and therefore don't particularly support the Weimar coalition in return. After the election of 1930, as you've seen, all that comes back is a minority government that's only going to be able to rule because the president is going to pass laws by decree using Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution. That means that the real power is only going to rest with the president and those around him. And increasingly, the people around the president have ties also to the military. The best example of this is a very interesting figure whose name is Kurt von Schleicher, who's going to continue to be an essential person for us to keep in mind over the course of the next 3 years. He had served with President Hindenburg's son during the First World War and maintained close connections to Hindenburg throughout the 1920s, and then was a very important figure in the Ministry of Defense starting in 1928. So real power rests with Hindenburg, who at this point is quite old, in his early 80s, and with those around him. And maybe the most important figure to remember around him is Kurt von Schleicher. Just as a sign of how unimportant and impotent the Reichstag is at this point, in February of 1931, they simply take a 6-month recess. So even Chancellor Brüning, who's the most powerful figure in the Reichstag, his power is pretty limited. He doesn't receive strong support from the nationalists, and in fact, his strongest support comes from the Socialist Party. This might seem surprising, but I think this is important for our characterization of the socialists, where they are, in many cases, willing to be pragmatic about stemming what they see as a rising tide of right-wing radicalism that is aimed at ending the Weimar Republic. And in this, they are not being paranoid. It is, in fact, fairly clear that most of the right-wing parties are anti-Weimar at this point. Even the right-wing parties that under Stresemann had been willing to support the Republic at this point are openly anti-Republic. However, if Brüning and von Schleicher and Hindenburg's plan is to change the German constitution in order to have a more centralized, a more powerful executive leader in the case of Hindenburg or in the case of a chancellor, it's not going to be possible. The SPD, the socialists, will not support this, and Brüning doesn't have the support of enough parties to pass any constitutional amendments. So what the right wants most is impossible. And so we move forward towards the idea of new elections. But before this, it's going to be necessary to have presidential election. And it's really, really clear here that the president is not, Hindenburg does not actually want to stand for re-election. That is an embarrassment. That is a difficult literal campaign for him to carry out at the age of 83. And he's not interested in this. Meanwhile, Brüning has banned paramilitaries, so the Nazi party is furious about this. And now von Schleicher enters the situation and essentially tries to negotiate with the National Socialists to have Hindenburg's term be extended without having to stand for re-election. And ultimately, Hitler and the Nazis reject this. And this leads to a presidential election. And this, in a lot of ways, feels like a modern election, and maybe the first modern election that we can point to in Europe. And by modern, I mean excessive use of propaganda, slogans. Hitler rents an airplane to fly around Germany. So it feels quite modern. And in the first round of the election, Hindenburg, the absolute hero of the First World War, comes just short of getting the 50% that's required for him to win without a runoff. He gets 49.6% of the vote, which means that there will be a runoff between Hindenburg, Thälmann, the communist, and Hitler for the Nazis. And there is a runoff. Hindenburg wins quite clearly. But the Nazis, Adolf Hitler as a presidential candidate, ends up with 37% of the vote, by far the highest Nazi vote total at this point. So it continues to feel as if the Nazi tide is rising. This is going to lead to increased optimism on the part of the Nazis and perhaps increased pragmatism on the part of the socialists. Von Schleicher and Hindenburg come to believe that Brüning has served his purpose, and he's asked for his resignation and he submits it. Hindenburg, at the urging of von Schleicher, appoints somebody whose name is Franz von Papen. And he's a very interesting choice, and in a lot of ways he's going to represent an undemocratic choice. He wasn't even a member of the Reichstag. He had been on again, off again with the Center Party. And actually, when he accepts being chancellor, the Center Party is so angry at the way that Brüning has been treated that they kick him out. So he is a man without party. And of course, the Weimar Republic depends on parties for the strength of its democracy. A major criticism that comes from the right is that there are too many parties. The solution to that, though, that they come up with is inherently undemocratic and is to have a man with no party. So Schleicher's goal and von Papen's goal through him is going to be to end the Republic as we know it, to push through constitutional changes and to transform the Weimar Republic into a much stronger executive in the position of the chancellor and certainly in the position of the president. To do this, they will need to have a bigger majority in the Reichstag, and so the idea of calling elections for July of 1932 makes a lot of sense on them. In order for the National Socialists to agree to this, part of, or at least to support this, their little agreement is not legally required, but is politically expedient. An agreement is made to lift the ban on the paramilitaries. And as soon as this is done, violence begins again in the streets, especially between the Red Front Fighters League and the Stormtroopers. After the ban is lifted, the Stormtroopers plan a march through a working class district of Hamburg in Prussia. And the inevitable violence breaks out. And there are more than a dozen people killed in the streets in fights between the Stormtroopers and the Red Front Fighters League. Instead of turning towards rebanning the paramilitaries, von Papen uses this to declare that the Prussian government, the government of the federal state of Prussia, which is about half of all of Germany, it's by far the largest of the federal states. And of course, remember that Weimar is a federal republic and is made up of these different federal states, just like the United States is made up of states, or Brazil is made up of different states. Von Papen declares that the Prussian government is not capable of maintaining order, that there's a state of emergency, and he takes over the running of the Prussian government from the democratically elected Prussian government, which at this point was controlled by the socialists. So the key thing about a federal republic, right, is that in some ways it's decentralized. So von Papen is able to use this Nazi-instigated violence. The Red Front Fighters League was, equally violent, but the Nazis picked a fight. He's able to use this in order to start his process of centralization. And this really is one of the key moments in what will end up being the death of the Weimar Republic, because we see the federal government increasing its power, and only through this increased federal power is the destruction of the democracy going to be able to be carried out. So essentially this coup, which is carried out by von Papen, destroys federalization and deeply undermines democracy. All of this leading up towards the elections of 1932. And if the presidential elections of 31 were any indication, the elections of 32 are going to be even more dramatic and even more sort of modern. And at this point, we're going to have the socialists are going to come together, and they're going to, essentially, they're going to come up with slogans, and they're going to wage this modern campaign. They're going to create their own semi-militarized group called the Iron Front. So now we have the Stormtroopers on the right, we have the Iron Front on the non-revolutionary left, and we have the Red Front Fighters League of the revolutionary left. So the atmosphere of power, of strength, of sort of metaphorical war in the streets of 32 is very, very strong. And one of the historians who I respect the most about this, and really a true pillar in the field, a man whose name is Richard Evans, has said that if the Social Democrats were to have any chance of beating the National Socialists at their own game, they should have started earlier. That these techniques of propaganda, of slogans, of symbols have really already been perfected by Hitler and the Nazis. And so now, if we take a look at the election results, we can see that if 1930 was a wake-up call, a surprise in terms of the success of the Nazis, that really, I think we need to view that as a two-step process. We have the election of 30, and then we have the election of 32 with the presidential election in the middle. And in 32, anybody's illusion that the National Socialists were weakening falls apart, and they become the largest single party in the Reichstag.